Welcome back, everyone. So sorry we weren't here last night. I'm on the road again. Actually, out here in California, doing a live tonight since we missed it yesterday. So good to see you all here. Yeah, how you doing, everyone? Now, I want to go over a few different stories. First off, I want to talk about Biden rejoining the Paris Climate Accord and specifically focusing on kind of how China manipulates these types of policies. Not very well known. China actually has a monopoly when it comes to a lot of green energy, especially when it comes to rare earth minerals and some of these different technologies they use. Also going into how the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, manipulates these things. I mean, not the least part of this being the fact that, well, the Paris Climate Accord doesn't really put regulations on China. It regulates the United States, regulates countries that are kind of a threat to China in this realm, but doesn't regulate China, meaning that throughout the extent of this whole thing, China could pretty much gain control of the energy industry, not just in the US, but in many countries. I'll go in depth into this actually tonight. Good seeing y'all here. Rainy Cascadia, thank you. Good seeing y'all here. Let's see, this is from Marie Giorgio. Good seeing you as always, actually. Good seeing you. Cameron Oliver, good seeing you as well. Thank you. How you doing? How you doing, everyone? All right. Yeah, kind of last minute. The problem we have with announcing the Q&As is YouTube, we can't really publish videos just blank saying, we can't make it tonight. And so we have to put the alerts in the community chat if we can't make it. And then, of course, on social media and stuff. But try to keep you all updated. Again, almost always I'll do Sunday, Tuesday, Thursday for the lives. The one exception just being if I can't get to an internet connection. And last night for Thursday, I was out doing interviews pretty late. And so, yeah, actually got some good interviews coming out for you folks on that note. In particular, I got the guys who did the film, what was it, God's Not Dead? And they did as well Unplanned, and talking about how they're pretty much moving to kind of overtake Hollywood. One interesting thing I've been seeing lately, talking to a lot of independent filmmakers, there's a lot of movement right now to basically take over Hollywood. Daily Wire starting up their own like this going on right now. All right, folks, that said, as always, if you have questions, leave them in the chat. I'll try to get to them. In the meantime, let's go over a few news stories. Now, I want to start off with this Paris Climate Accord and what's going on with that. So this is Epoch Times, says here, Beijing wants to sway U.S. policy using climate change, experts warn. And it says here, the Biden administration should not allow the Chinese regime, this is an opinion article, opinion analysis, so take it as such, right? It says the Biden administration should not allow the Chinese regime to use climate change as a bargaining chip to extract concessions in other areas, according to China experts. The warning comes as the United States formally rejoined the Paris Agreement on February 19th, right? Meaning, of course, Biden rejoined it today. And President Joe Biden has described climate change as a, quote, existential threat and vowed to do more to reduce carbon emissions. But analysts are concerned that this may lead the United States to become cozier with the Chinese regime. Now, important point with the Paris Climate Accord, under Trump, the United States already exceeded the carbon emissions standards that were required in it. In fact, the U.S. cut carbon emissions more than any other country that was on the agreement, meaning that without being part of it, Trump demonstrated it was more effective for the United States. He surpassed its requirements. And this brings up the question, well, what's the real purpose of it then, right? Let's go deeper into this. It says, the warning comes as the United States it says, while Biden officials have broadly indicated they would continue the Trump administration's tough on China posture, they have also pointed to cooperative aspects of the U.S.-China relationship. On the campaign trail, Biden said he'd work with the regime, meaning China, in areas of common interest such as climate change and preventing nuclear proliferation. Experts fear that U.S. cooperation on climate change could lead the administration to give ground in other key domains such as human rights, trade, and national security. Now, the Chinese regime has already indicated that the United States would have to accept its own terms before the two sides could work together. And this is according to Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson Zhao Lijian, who said on January 28th, quote, it said China is ready to cooperate with the United States and the international community on climate change, and added, that said, I'd like to stress that China-U.S. cooperation in specific areas is closely linked with bilateral relations as a whole. And he continued, stating that no one should imagine they could ask China to understand and support them in bilateral and global affairs when they blatantly interfere in China's domestic affairs and undermine China's interests. Now, when the Chinese Communist Party uses phrases like this, it's really important. Foreign Ministry spokesperson, when they say interfere in China's domestic affairs, what they mean is criticizing the Chinese Communist Party's human rights abuses. They mean that if you criticize their use of live organ harvesting from political dissidents and religious believers, by criticizing them for harvesting people's organs while they're still alive, you are interfering in their domestic affairs. They say that if you criticize Muslim slave labor, like they have in Xinjiang, if you criticize that and sanction them, you are interfering in China's domestic affairs. If you criticize them for overtaking Hong Kong, right, and overthrowing their agreement with the UK, violating it, and then violating the rights of the Hong Kong people, if you criticize them for it, then you are interfering with their affairs. When the Chinese Communist Party uses keywords like this, all they're doing is playing on the different talking points that Americans tend to believe in, playing on things like, foreign policy, they tie it to these things rather than human rights issues, to use words that we commonly hear to frame it emotionally, using these words that we've been conditioned to react in certain ways towards. And so they say blatantly interfere in China's domestic affairs. That is what they're referring to. And when they say undermine China's interests, what are they really saying here? They mean stepping in the way of the Chinese Communist Party's global ambitions. Things like the One Belt, One Road initiative. Things like overtaking global technology. Things like, for example, spreading the China model, as they call it, which is the Chinese Communist Party's form of government that they're trying to export. Meaning things like the social credit system, things like monitoring programs that keep track not only of you, not only of your online purchases, but that of every single person you're connected to, and then gives you a social rating based on that and determines your freedom or oppression in society based on your citizen score. This is the kind of stuff the Chinese Communist Party is exporting. And when they talk about undermining China's interests, they mean doing anything that messes with its global agenda, right? That's what they're talking about. Let's go deeper into this. It says the Chinese Communist Party has labeled a range of topics such as repression of minorities in Xinjiang and Tibet, the crackdown in Hong Kong, and intimidation of Taiwan as part of its core interests and not open for discussion. The way the Chinese Communist Party works is they have no-go topics. And so if you want to negotiate with them, there are certain things you are not allowed to talk about. If you talk about them, they stand up and they walk out of the room. And the Chinese Communist Party can use diplomacy, use negotiations like this to prevent discussion on the things that really matter. Now, it continues here. Zhao's comments were made after Special Presidential Envoy for Climate, John Kerry, pledged that important issues, including the CCP's theft of intellectual property and military aggression in the South China Sea, quote, will never be traded for anything that has to do with climate. So they're alleging that intellectual property theft, military aggression in the South China Sea will never be traded for anything that has to do with climate. Inconsequential, the Chinese Communist Party already mostly controls the South China Sea, unless the U.S. continues to really, let's say, get behind other countries to strongly push back against them, right? They've already built islands there. We already let them do that. The only thing we're not letting them do is establish no-go zones, right? These ADIZ, anti-access zones. And when it comes to them stealing our intellectual property, look, they've been doing it nonstop since Obama. They did it under Trump as well. The only reason they stopped to some extent, right, and they kept doing it, was because Trump started putting sanctions on them. So Trump started hitting the individual companies that were involved in it. In other words, bypassing the CCP entirely, right? He went around the Chinese Communist Party entirely and went after the individual Chinese companies and sanctioned them for doing that. And unless Biden does that, it doesn't matter what they talk about at the political level, because the Chinese Communist Party doesn't care about those surface level political discussions. You bring an agreement to them, they will sign it, and then they will violate it, and then they'll laugh in your face as you fail to enforce it. As happened under Obama, for example, when he signed this agreement with Xi Jinping, again, after he indicted these 5 Chinese hackers who never really faced charges or anything, right? Nothing ever happened to them. Let's keep going on this. It says, but Kerry added, this is John Kerry, that, quote, climate change is a critical standalone issue, noting that China is the world's largest emitter of greenhouse gases at about 30%. And he said, so it's urgent that we find a way to compartmentalize to move forward. The problem with that, the Paris Climate Accord puts no requirements on the Chinese Communist Party, at least not for a significant amount of time, meaning that they can talk all they want about China being the biggest emitter of greenhouse gases, right? Coal plants and things like that. And yes, Xi Jinping is saying they're going to move beyond that. They're going to go to clean energy. They're not showing signs of actually making a real shift. In fact, they're building more and more coal plants, if you even believe the narrative in the first place, right? The Paris Climate Accord, even if they say we have to engage with China, we have to do stuff to them, it puts no requirements on them. That was one of the reasons why Trump tossed it out. He said it benefits the Chinese Communist Party and harms the United States. And he demonstrated that by abandoning it, by not signing it, that we were better off anyways, even if you do believe all the narratives. Greenhouse emission cuts went down in the U.S., right? Greenhouse emissions went down in the U.S. Beyond the requirements of the accord anyways, under Trump. And so if it was already being done, if the U.S. was already meeting its requirements, why sign in paper something that restricts the U.S. from competing on energy when Biden also eliminated the policy that restricts the Chinese Communist Party from overtaking the American energy infrastructure, right? And we're seeing the impact of some of that as well with these green energy programs in places like Texas, where they lost power and would have lost it for a whole lot longer had they not acted right when they did. In fact, had they gone a few minutes longer, allegedly it would have been down for close to a month, something like that. Let's keep going on this. It says here, Gordon Chang, author of The Coming Collapse of China, recently told the Epoch Times that it would not be possible for the United States to cooperate with the regime, meaning China, given the conditions it imposes. And he said, quote, China's position is that you either have good relationships with us on everything or nothing. Right? It's all or nothing diplomacy. If you criticize them on anything, you are nothing. If you allow them to do anything, you're fine. Now, we saw this happen, for example, during the virus outbreak, when many countries, such as Australia and others, began calling for investigations into the origin of the virus. And yes, now the WHO has claimed that the virus may have come from outside China. They're saying multiple sources, things like this. Even the United States is not buying it under Biden. Even the U.S. is not accepting the WHO's conclusion on that right now. But remember what happened during the virus outbreak when a lot of countries were calling for investigations into the origin. The Chinese Communist Party burned its bridges with most countries that criticized it, including Australia being one of the big examples of this, including, for example, many European countries, Germany, for example. They called for investigations. The Chinese Communist Party came back and threatened them on trade, on other issues, students going to Australia and so on. In other words, just like Gordon Chang said, China's position is that you either have good relationships with us on everything or nothing. And Australia demonstrated that by not having good relationships with them on one area, which was calling for just investigations into the origin of a pandemic, which under normal circumstances, if the animal reservoir claim was even accurate to begin with, you would need to know what the animal reservoir is if you're going to deal with the pandemic and stop it, which means it was a totally normal thing to ask. And the fact is that countries not aggressively pursuing that, if they actually cared about dealing with the virus, would have been one of the most fundamental things to address in terms of stopping the virus if they actually cared about it, right? And so here we are. Let's go deeper into this. Gordon Chang continues, quote, if we're given that choice, it should be nothing, because China is trying to constrict those areas where we can have a constructive discussion. Can't criticize anything that is sensitive, can't criticize human rights abuses, can't criticize slave labor, can't criticize their model of doing things that abuse human rights, that treat human life like trash, and that really try to undermine politics and subvert them in just about every country of the world, including, for example, engaging in different forms of debt traps to essentially subjugate countries throughout Latin America, Asia, and Africa, and trying to do the same thing to Western countries as well now. Let's go into this deeper. Now, Cheng noted that in any event, the United States does not need to offer anything to get the regime to take action on climate. And he said this: the Chinese are on the same planet that we are, so they've got the same interest in preventing climate change to the extent that it's occurring. So we don't need to give them anything for it. Now, I won't go too much deeper into this, but you got the idea. Biden is rejoining the Paris Climate Accord, through this talking about re-engaging with the Chinese Communist Party on climate change. It's important to note that if you actually go in, now there's different narratives in terms of what he's doing with China. On the surface, if you go into his actual policies, during the elections, the only China policy he actually really had was encouraging, not even requiring, but encouraging the Chinese Communist Party to have better environmental standards in its One Belt, One Road initiative, meaning basically still allow the Chinese Communist Party to get countries engaged in debt traps through One Belt, One Road, to allow them to still export the China model, to allow them to build this type of high-tech tyranny that they're using through that, right? Allowing them to do that, but asking them, not requiring them, but asking them to have better environmental policies while they do it. That was the extent of the written Biden policy on China. Now, he faces a difficult issue, which is that Trump really did change the international discussion on China, right? He made it publicly known the degree to which China infiltrates politics, the degree to which they infiltrate schools, the degree to which they engage in not just economic theft, but theft at the, say, academic level, when it comes to think tanks, when it comes to university research, financed by taxpayer money oftentimes, when it comes to them subverting journalists and subverting other institutions, all this kind of came to light. Also exposing, for example, sanctioning and declaring a genocide, the Chinese Communist Party's persecution of Muslim Uyghurs. All of the CCP's abuses became public knowledge. And even outside of the Trump effect, right, we saw as well India take a stronger stance. We saw Angela Merkel and Germany take a stronger stance. We saw Japan, Australia, other countries take stronger stances. Unraveling that is not easy at this point because public knowledge right now is pretty good. Public knowledge right now is to the degree that if he got rid of some of these policies, it would look really bad on the United States. It would mean the United States is siding with the regime that engages not only in genocide, but also in slave labor. And they're doing it to an extent already, but he can only change it so much right now without causing, let's say, a image-based PR crisis, basically. Now, let me go over a couple questions, and then we'll go into some more stories. All right, let's see here. Oh, the drink tonight, by the way, is pu'er. It's like preserved tea. It's pretty good, actually. If you get the decent stuff, it's pretty good. Yeah, I brought my own tea traveling this time. All right. This is according to Christy No. He said, Josh, thanks for helping me get through some really tough evenings after knee replacement surgery. Oh, sorry to hear, but yeah, thank you also. He said, every show is great, and I appreciate you and your team very much. Oh, thank you. I appreciate it. This is from Priscilla S. Bright. Hello from Kentucky. How you doing? This is from Joe S. You said, I don't think Texas can charge their laptops and phones to join this chat. Various that are out of power, that is, water shortages. Yeah, so folks, Texas is still not doing so well right now. You, of course, had these rolling blackouts. In fact, we were going to have an interview with Casey Fleming. He's the CEO of Black Ops Partners Corporation, one of the top experts on Chinese subversion. And he's in Texas. Actually, he had to cancel because he lost power. A lot of people are affected by this. Now, a lot of places have gotten power back, but now they're having water shortages in some areas. A concern when you're dealing with critical infrastructure, and critical infrastructure, oftentimes, water filtration systems still depend to an extent on the electric grid. If the electric grid goes down, it can have a rolling impact on other things as well. Hey, Dennis Latil, you said aloha from Hawaii. Thank you. Yeah, aloha. This is from Liz Williams. You said, hi from Texas. Electricity is up and running for me. Glad to hear. This is from Tony Goza. You said, what is up with Supreme Court and the election lawsuits? Okay, so important to note, folks, you might have heard your friends or family or other media saying that, every lawsuit that the Trump team brought forward about the elections has been tossed out. There's no evidence of it. Yeah, Tony Goza asking, right? There's no evidence of it. They didn't succeed in a single one. Media are saying it's baseless claims, right? Baseless claims, baseless rumors. I'm sure you've all seen this all over the place, right? Trump spreads baseless rumor about elections and so on, right? Let's be clear. 2/3 of the cases where the evidence was actually heard, the Trump side won. 2/3 they won, right? And in addition to that, you still have these court cases going to the Supreme Court. In fact, the Supreme Court is set to hear them, meaning that this is still going on. The Supreme Court is set to hear cases brought forward by Sidney Powell, Lin Wood, and the Trump team, and others. And based on this, according to information coming up before the election, as we were then discussing this, and we'll have to see what's decided, because I don't think we've ever dealt with anything like this as a country, right? In terms of what's happening with these lawsuits brought to the Supreme Court alleging widespread fraud, right? If these win, they can overturn the elections, possibly. We'll have to see how it goes, because technically they can if they were brought forward before the Electoral College vote, and potentially afterwards as well, right? Potentially afterwards as well, but at the very least, the ones brought forward, but filed before the Electoral College vote, meaning that you have very strong cases, because we've gone over the evidence plenty of times now, leading up to all this. Very strong evidence of what happened during the elections. And I'm sure many of you have watched, for example, the hearings that were done, not in Washington, but in different states, where they were going to the state legislatures and bringing forward the evidence and having people and sworn testimony counts as evidence. People basically saying that they are swearing that what they're saying is true under penalty of perjury, right? That they're going to bring this forward. And yes, if there is evidence to the degree that it could overturn the election, then yes, it can overturn the election. And my theory right now, we'll have to see, maybe this is why they were trying to impeach Trump, right? Maybe the reason why they're doing everything they can to stop him right now is because if they can impeach him and make him ineligible to become president again, it means that if these cases succeed, they cannot overturn it, right? Whether that's their intention or not, that would be the impact of what they were trying to do, right? And so they're behaving like, the media is behaving dishonestly. Let's be clear, right? They're lying to you in every article they make, in every mention they make. In every mention they make about the case, they say baseless claims. Trump made baseless accusations. So-and-so made baseless claims. So-and-so spread baseless rumors. And the media is complicit. Politicians are complicit. Social media is complicit in lying on that. Now, what's the reality on this as well? We'll have to see what happens, whether it is enough to overturn things if they succeed with the lawsuits. And yes, again, you have Trump, Lin Wood, Sidney Powell's lawsuits going forward again, right? Supreme Court scheduled to hear them. They are set to hear these cases. It's possible they could toss it out. Who knows? We'll have to see how the Supreme Court acts, right? Set to hear them, scheduled to hear them. That is still going on. Nobody's talking about it. Now, the other big question is not only aside from the possibility of this potentially overturning things and whatever else it could impact, is if they can prove conspiracy, meaning people working in conjunction with each other on that, right? If they can prove insurrection, if they can prove collusion, if they can prove that people were working together, not randomly committing fraud and so on, like, one worker gets unhappy and changes the name on a computer somewhere or something like that. If they can prove that there was cooperation, coordination behind the scenes, and it was enough to actually impact things and overturn things, then it means people are going to go to prison as well. And the extent, the full spectrum of that scandal, which it would be at that point, could lead to a lot of very powerful people going to prison. And it could lead to not people just in the United States being incriminated in this, but even people in other countries possibly as well. We'll have to see how it unfolds. Now, media is not talking about this because they seem to have it in their interest to do the opposite. They have it in their interest to say baseless claims, no evidence, don't even look at it. And if you... This is from Honest Annie. You said, why would Biden rescind Trump's order keeping China out of our national power grid? I've gone over this quite a few times. So I don't want to repeat myself too much because past several episodes, I think we talked about that. It's not clear why Biden would want to do that. But what we can say is that by doing it, if the China were allowed to gain control of the American electric grid, that is what you would call critical infrastructure, meaning that a foundational system that if it is under threat or shut down impacts the entire country, right? Meaning that it is a foundational, critical security level threat or security issue, meaning that you could basically control a country by controlling it. This is what Russia does to Europe with control of natural gas. You might remember with the whole Uranium One scandal, that was the big conflict within that they made the deal with Russia, selling them American uranium and Canadian uranium. It was a Canadian company. Regardless of the fact that internal U.S. intelligence was showing, as was reported in Clinton Cash and other reports, which wasn't controversial back then. New York Times even wrote about it, right? That Russia was trying to use energy to control Europe. China does the same thing, right? They tried doing the same thing, for example, by building a nuclear power plant in the UK. They were doing the same thing in other places where they do this One Belt, One Road initiative and put things in place in other countries the same way to control the critical infrastructure of those countries. If they control it, they can shut it down. And what has China demonstrated in terms of narratives that it can use to shut you down? Criticize its policies, criticize its human rights abuses, criticize economic theft, criticize slavery, human trafficking, live organ harvesting, criticize these things. They control your country, one of their key infrastructures, and they can shut it down if they want to. That is the risk of letting them have that, of giving them access to that. All right, let's see here. Let's go to a couple more stories for the night. This is Epoch Times. Actually, a pretty crazy story here. Yeah. It says here, major U.S. airlines will voluntarily collect international contact tracing info. And it says here, Washington. Major U.S. airlines on Friday said they would adopt a voluntary international contact tracing program months after the White House, under President Donald Trump, blocked a mandatory effort. It says American Airlines, Delta Airlines, Southwest Airlines, United Airlines, and other major airlines said they had committed to collecting contact tracing data from passengers traveling into the United States and to relaying that data to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention if travelers provide information. Why is this concerning? Not so much in my analysis, right? Take it for what it's worth. Not so much in my analysis because of contact tracing, because states are already doing this to some extent. Serious in this regard, concerning in this regard, because what you see again is private businesses, corporations, taking into action policies that were blocked by the President of the United States. The President of the United States blocked this from happening, and corporations are taking it up on themselves to create this standard using their monopoly over this industry to do so. Again, right? that the White House under President Trump blocked an effort on this that would have made this mandatory. International contact tracing, meaning that if you travel internationally, there's contact tracing, tracing who you interacted with, tracing who you met with, tracing who you were in contact with, and using that to assess partly, right? To assess partly if you might have been exposed to the virus. Trump blocked that. What happens? American Airlines, Delta Airlines, Southwest Airlines, United Airlines, and other major airlines saying they're going to implement this themselves and then pass the information they collect to the CDC, Center for Disease Control. Now, virus aside, take it as much as you'd like in terms of whether you think this is necessary to actually fight the virus, right? I think everyone has their own assessment. The concern with this is what happens once the pandemic is over. How often is it that a company and the government develops new regulations and new policies and new technologies through those policies and says, all right, well, here's this multi-million-dollar project we implemented that allows us to monitor private information on people and who they're in contact with. Well, virus is over. Let's just toss out this multi-million-dollar investment that gives us private information on people's movements and interactions and so on that we could, sell for advertising money if we wanted to, and sell to governments around the world for various purposes. Let's just toss it out. How often does that actually happen? Right? Not very often. How often is it that government creates new policies and new regulations and does away with the policies? Almost never. Typically, the way government works is the opposite. Typically, they add new regulations onto existing regulations. They do not get rid of regulations. They amend regulations. They put new things on top of them, not get rid of them. Meaning that if countries, if the US government, if different states build technologies for this type of tracing of citizens and of other people, the chances of them getting rid of it are slim to none. Let's put it that way. At the very least, they would keep it in case a country demands it being used. And the problem with that is, well, look, this is the kind of stuff the Chinese Communist Party has. Social credit system, as I mentioned earlier. Systems that allow them to trace who you are interacting with. What are your online purchases? What are your travel patterns? What are your physical movements? To monitor not just you, but the individuals you're in contact with. And what is the technology? What is the degree to which they have to monitor you to even have that information in the first place, right? Now, I don't know how many of you have, maybe friends or family in police or whatever, and have, maybe seen the types of technology that police already have access to on this kind of stuff. It's already pretty frightening. If, for example, they have these laptops in their police cars and so on, and, intelligence community is going to have even bigger stuff than this, but even just police, they can type phone number, email address, name into a machine. It's going to show not just your name, not just your birth date, social security number, private information. It's going to have the different emails you use. It's going to have GPS tracking data from your phone. They have this information. This is not even intelligence level stuff. This is police level stuff, right? GPS data, where you were. They can see other phone numbers within that GPS data. Who else was near you? They already have this stuff. It's not conspiracy. This is normal law enforcement type stuff. Not even like, intelligence department type stuff. If you get into other stuff too, they can see if they can trace what emails you use, what pseudonyms you use, what types of web services you use. This stuff is already being collected, right? They already have this stuff. Not to mention the type of data being collected on you by big corporations already. And if you might have seen the stories, for example, of government agencies buying this data, right? Buying this data on individuals from the big corporations like Facebook and Twitter and so on, right? Not saying directly, but like them, right? Buying this data, which gives them a wild amount of information. Internet search history, products you might be buying, what you're looking at online, chat logs, if you've given an app access to your chat logs, metadata, right? Facial recognition, camera, access to your camera, access to your microphone. when you install an app and it says access to your notes, access your notes, access your microphone, access your camera, access your contact, and access your contacts, access GPS data, what do you think you're giving them access to, right? And what do they do with that information? How do these massive, billionaire level companies make their billions of dollars with free products? If you're installing a free app on your phone, how are they becoming billionaires, right? They're selling it. They're taking this data from you and they're selling it. That's how they're doing it, right? And so again, the concern here is they're adding more forms of tracking that can be used for things like this, right? One of the big concerns with this. Yeah, and your photos as well. Someone mentioned photos. Yeah, be careful what you store on your phone. All right, let's go into a few more stories, and we'll go into a few more questions. This is Epoch Times again. It says New York's Cuomo, Governor Andrew Cuomo, vows to, quote, aggressively take on lies, that's a direct quote, amid nursing home scandal, right? It says here, New York Governor Andrew Cuomo was defensive of his state's handling of nursing home patients during the CCP Communist Party virus pandemic, saying he would, quote, aggressively take on lies as a growing number of officials call for an investigation. Just real quick, actually, those of you interested in watching maybe a documentary on the type of data that's collected on people, there's one called The Creepy Line, I believe it is. Yeah, it's called The Creepy Line. If you want to watch a documentary giving some insight into the type of data that you are surrendering to big corporations and governments on a daily basis through the apps you may have on your phone and so on, check out the documentary called The Creepy Line. I think you'll find it quite shocking, actually. And keep in mind, for several years, 2008 to like 2012, I was a technology reporter and later editor, and I also wrote a lot on, it was a side job of Epoch Times, and I also wrote a lot on cybersecurity, and so I've been researching this stuff for a long time as well. All right, let's go deeper into the story now. It says New York Governor Andrew Cuomo again, right, is saying he would aggressively take on what he calls lies, as a growing number of officials call for investigations into him about, again, right, the actions he did with the senior homes with the virus. Now it says here, Cuomo, a Democrat, has come under fire from members of his own party in recent weeks over how his administration in March chose to require nursing homes to accept patients recovering from COVID-19. It says here, on Friday, Cuomo again stated it was the best option at the time to help free up desperately needed beds at the state's hospitals. Look, if he needed to free up beds at the hospitals, why was he not sending them to the hospital ship the Trump administration had moved to a New York port to handle overflow like this? Why was he not doing that? Maybe it's because he didn't want to validate the aid that Trump had provided. Maybe he wanted to bypass that and he didn't want to make it look didn't want to make Trump look like he was helping. Maybe that was part of it. Maybe it was something else. And then why did he cover it up? Right? Why did his office cover it up if they did not feel guilty about it? Why would they want to do that, right? Why would they try to withhold information from the public and intentionally, it seems, hide it from the public? Right? Maybe it's because they knew they did something wrong. It says here, on Friday, Cuomo again stated it was the best option at the time. Right, we'll have to see how that goes. Now, Cuomo said Friday he felt he needed to address the criticism more forcefully because, quote, lies about his handling of the pandemic were angering people whose loved ones had died. Well, typically, if you've had a loved one die because of a government policy, you might be a little bit mad at the government, right? Now, Cuomo said this, quote, I'm not going to let you hurt New Yorkers. You're hurting New Yorkers by criticizing the government for creating a policy that killed seniors, and then exposing the government for doing that. You're hurting New Yorkers, right? I'm not going to let you hurt New Yorkers by lying about what happened surrounding the death of a loved one, Cuomo said during a news conference in Albany, the state capital. He's continued, so I'm going to take on the lies and the unscrupulous actors, especially when they cause pain and damage to New York. It says in the conference, Cuomo praised his health committee for a great job, that's a quote, done during the pandemic. And he said, quote, I'm sorry you have to do it in a lousy political environment, but that's where we are. And he said, sorry that you had to deal with COVID. Sorry that you had to deal with a pandemic. I'm sorry that you had to miss your family working 7 days a week. And I'm sorry you have to be abused in the partisan politics of the day. Well, maybe he's going to withdraw from partisan politics. That would be a thing, right? Now, it says Cuomo's come under increased pressure in recent days after a New York Post report found that one of his top aides, Melissa DeRosa, told lawmakers in a private call that the administration withheld CCP virus data regarding nursing home deaths because the state was being investigated by the Department of Justice under President Donald Trump last year. Now, if the administration, if a government office being investigated by the Department of Justice intentionally withheld data on a virus about deaths of its own citizens, what does it call when you try to hide data, hide evidence during an investigation by the Department of Justice? What do you normally call it if you're being investigated by the Department of Justice, and because you're being investigated, you intentionally hide evidence? Right, obstruction, right? Normally that would be called obstruction. It says in January, Attorney General, or arguably, right, we'll have to see. It says, now in January, Attorney General Letitia James released a report accusing the state government of deliberately undercounting COVID-19 deaths in nursing homes by as much as 50%, 50%, half of them, right? Deliberately undercounted. Why were they deliberately altering the numbers of deaths in senior homes, nursing homes specifically? Maybe it's because they felt that they did something wrong, right? Now, it says here, the report triggered a cavalcade of calls for an investigation from Republicans and also Democrats, including Socialist Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and New York Mayor Bill de Blasio. Cortez said this: thousands of vulnerable New Yorkers lost their lives in nursing homes through the pandemic. Their loved ones and the public deserve answers and transparency from their elected leadership. And the secretary to the governor's remarks warrant a full investigation. Now, separately, Queens Assemblyman Ron Kim, also a Democrat, accused Cuomo of threatening to destroy him if he didn't place a more positive spin on DeRosa's statement. He alleged that Cuomo threatened to destroy, that's a quote, destroy him if he didn't frame it in a positive way. Cuomo, according to his allegation, of course. Now, Cuomo advisor about his conversation with the governor. And so a Cuomo advisor is alleging that another person involved in his administration herself fabricated details about this conversation, trying to involvement of Cuomo in that. They're trying to throw someone else under the bus. Now, he said this, quote, "At no time did anyone threaten to destroy anyone with their wrath nor engage in a cover-up. That's beyond the pale and is unfortunately part of a years-long pattern of lies by Mr. Kim against this administration." So he's saying that they're not talking about threatening to destroy anyone with their wrath nor engage in a cover-up, despite actual evidence of a cover-up and claims of a cover-up. And after saying that that's lies, that the aggression is not there, Cuomo said he's going to aggressively take on lies. It's not going so well for him right now. Let's put it that way. And also now you have, next story here, de Blasio, New York City mayor, as opposed to Cuomo, the governor of New York, de Blasio backing lawmakers' claims against Cuomo, saying the bullying is nothing new. And let's go into this just briefly, right? New York Mayor, Bill de Blasio took aim at Governor Andrew Cuomo over allegations that he threatened New York State Assemblyman Ron Kim during a heated phone call. And so while Cuomo himself is basically exaggerating or altering information, Bill de Blasio is getting behind Ron Kim against Cuomo. And Cuomo reportedly again called Ron Kim on February 11th after news broke of the alleged cover-up. And in a phone call, Cuomo reportedly threatened Kim, also a Democrat, I mean, these are all Democrats, threatened him, saying he will be finished and destroyed, according to the outlet. Now, this is according to de Blasio. De Blasio said, yeah, it's a sad thing to say, but that's classic Andrew Cuomo. A lot of people in New York State have received those phone calls. And if Cuomo's talking about aggressively going after lies, and de Blasio's saying that, yes, he did threaten people, and he's even saying now that a lot of people in New York have received those phone calls, it means that Cuomo, according to de Blasio, is making threats like this on a pretty large scale. Now, I won't go too much deeper into this, but part of the tearing apart of themselves from within their own party now that we're seeing. Now, classic Saul Alinsky. Typically, you see Democrats walk in lockstep. They don't really go after each other as much, right? It's not normally how they operate. If you go back to Saul Alinsky, Rules for Radicals, one of the foundations of community organizing and radical leftist organizations, he said, never strike left. Never strike left, right? In other words, they typically don't target each other. They typically only go after people who are beneficial for the revolution and the movement to go after. Now that they have a supermajority, it seems that they're kind of turning on each other now. It does seem to be the case. Now, we go a bit deeper what's happening with Washington right now. Another story here. This is having to do with the January 6th protests and Capitol protest. It says here, 6 more people linked to Oath Keepers indicted for conspiracy to obstruct Congress. Oath Keepers are a militia, specifically one of former military law enforcement. And the nature of the Oath Keeper label is, right, they swore to protect the Constitution, and they believe that by upholding these standards that they are keeping their oaths. Now it says 6 more individuals linked to the paramilitary Oath Keepers group were indicted on Friday for allegedly conspiring to obstruct Congress on January 6th, among other charges. Their names were added as co-defendants to a superseding indictment also made against 3 people linked to the Oath Keepers group charged last month. Now, I won't go too deep into this, but basically 6 more individuals, 9 in total now from Oath Keepers, having been indicted for conspiracy to obstruct Congress or related charges. Now, you have obstruction of justice. You also have obstruction of Congress, obstruction of the legislative branch of government. I mentioned before there was also talk about obstruction of the executive branch, something that Trump could consider, given that, well, you saw the intelligence community, politicians, media, and so on obstructing his office using false narratives like the Trump-Russia hoax. Right? We saw this. They're now going after people who protested on January 6th for conspiracy to obstruct Congress. And, to what extent do you have peaceful protest, right? You have a right to peaceful assembly in the United States, right? You have the right to peacefully assemble. Were these individuals violent, right? Were they violent, or are they being charged merely because the act of protesting is believed in this case to have obstructed Congress because they were protesting to ask them essentially to count the dueling elector votes which 7 states brought forward, right? And so we'll have to see what comes out of this, but really things are playing out in ways that are not quite, let's say, not a normal way of dealing with things. Let's put it that way. And as well, as I mentioned, you have Nancy Pelosi now looking to form a congressional investigative body to look into this. The problem being that Pelosi herself was in charge of security at the Capitol building. And you have a lot of issues that happened with security at the Capitol, meaning that in a normal investigation, she would be a subject of investigation as well. Because under a normal investigation, you would not just investigate the people who were protesting. You would also investigate what allowed them to enter the building, meaning security. You would also investigate officers not responding to if there were acts of violence and acts of, destruction of property when you had officers all over the place in that building. And when you also had them refuse Trump's offer of having the National Guard presence, when you also had allegations of stand-down orders being given to additional people who were there. Pelosi was in charge of that. And so how is it that one of the people who would normally be under a normal investigation, part of the investigation, a target of the investigation, herself creating and enforcing a body, right, calling for the creation of a body to investigate something that she herself had some part in? Now, I mentioned before, that's how you see the mafia work, right? The mafia will commit its crimes. Not saying she did this, but it's the same thing, right? In terms of practice, that they will have, of course, the things that they're involved within, but then they'll create the bodies to advise the police or bribe police or so on, in order to not investigate the things that they were involved in. And by doing that, they can have basically crimes that are impossible to prosecute because the chances of them being investigated are very slim because they are regulating and controlling the investigative process, right? Meaning that, again, this is one of the concerns. I'm not alleging she's doing this intentionally, but by controlling the investigation, having the investigation started by and called for investigation of one of the people who should herself be investigated, brings to question, will someone investigate themselves? And will that be a really partial, right, non-partial investigation if you're investigating yourself, right? How do you have a person investigate something they were involved in and have that be a fair investigation? Now, the other side of this is they're actually asking for the ability to prosecute, meaning that the same thing they did to Trump, right? Having the ability to prosecute through a congressional body, like they did with the impeachment, a private citizen, right, overstepping the boundaries of this, going through Congress rather than the court system, they want to do that to the American people now. They want to have the ability to prosecute through this investigative body they're now establishing. And again, the concern, is this an impartial court? Right? Is this an investigative body, a legal body that can act without, preformed notions, when they themselves on note of this, when they themselves are considered the victims of this because they're making themselves out to be the victims, right? How do you have an alleged victim of a crime, the people claiming that they themselves are the victim, leading not only the investigative process, but also leading the process to prosecute people? How can you have the victim do that? You know what you normally call that? You call it a lynching. Normally, that is what you would call it. That is what is called a lynching, where people band together and form their own little system of justice and then act on it, bypassing the court system. Normally, you would call that a lynching. They're looking to lynch people, is what you have happening right now. Now, let's go over over one more story on this, then I want to go to a few questions. Actually, I'll go to maybe a couple more. This is another one here. It says, Antifa could be branded as domestic terrorists under bill being discussed in Montana. And it says here, lawmakers in Montana are in discussions regarding a bill that would classify the anarcho-communist group Antifa as a domestic terror organization. Now, Antifa networks and ideologically affiliated groups have conducted violent street protests and riots in a number of cities over the past several years, including in Minneapolis, Portland, Seattle, Olympia, and elsewhere. Montana State Representative Braxton Mitchell, a Republican, representing Columbia Falls, told the Montana House Judiciary Committee during a Tuesday hearing that the bill is still being considered. The move would, quote, send a message that we as a state won't tolerate a group like this coming into our state, according to the AP. Now, opponents of the measure said that such a bill should be opposed if it does not classify other groups accused of violent acts, including groups that partook in the U.S. Capitol breach in January. Now, we'll have to see where this goes, but basically, basically what they're saying is that if you're going to classify Antifa as a terrorist organization, then you need to classify other groups that were involved in the U.S. Capitol breach as terrorist organizations. Now, we'll have to see what this means. Now, personally, I would say that classifying Antifa as a terrorist organization is a well-founded stance, given their intentional stated use of violence, which media and even politicians have defended, and the carrying out of that violence, which they say they're going to do with the intention of political suppression. Now, the definitions of terrorism have changed a bit, but normally in the past, it was the use of violence for political purpose. And by its stated values, by its stated purpose, Antifa uses violence and intimidation for the purpose of political suppression. This is exactly what they do. Now, they're alleging that people protesting should also be classified as terrorists if Antifa is classified as terrorists. And what you have here is a state, right? In this case, talking about Montana, you have a state talking about creating that designation, bypassing the federal government to make that. Now, we can see what happens with it. Personally, again, I would say that it's justified to call Antifa a terrorist organization. In fact, to an extent, they already have been pseudo-classified as such. For example, in New Jersey, where they were classified under, a domestic terrorist, at least page of a website for the government in New Jersey. Not a hard classification, but partially at least. The problem with this, though, is if they do move forward with this, and actually possibly regardless of whether they move forward with this, we're going to be seeing now whether states can classify groups as terrorists based on, essentially state law. And if, for example, they do classify Antifa as terrorists, will, for example, Oath Keepers be classified in Washington as terrorists? We saw, for example, in New York, the Proud Boys by the local mayor here were classified as a gang, right? They were classified as a gang while Antifa was let off essentially scot-free. You had Antifa and the Proud Boys fighting in New York streets, and the local government classified the Proud Boys, but not Antifa, as a gang. And by doing that, they used this ability to classify to incriminate their actions. Now, of course, gang is a lot different than terrorist, but we'll have to see what this means. This could be, again, part of this broader picture that I've been saying we're very likely going to start seeing. Part of this broader picture we're going to start seeing where states begin enacting their own laws, their own way of doing things that are going to be different state by state, right? State by state. And so you're going to have different states creating different laws that are different from the federal government, very different based on partisan lines, very different from the federal government and different from other states. And this is going to create ideological divisions along partisan lines, even more strongly between states. And we'll have to see what the trajectory of this is, and also whether that can be challenged at the Supreme Court level if the Biden administration doesn't pack the courts and gain supermajority, not just of the executive branch and the legislative branch, but also of the court system, right? The judiciary branch as well. We'll have to see how this goes. All right, let's see here. I'll go over a few more questions. This is from Big Rig. You said, Josh, can you interview Hunter Biden? I'd consider it. I don't know. That'd be quite the interesting interview. I could say that much. It's from Heather Green. He said, speaking of Antifa, where was their counter protest in DC on January 6th? Yeah, I don't think they had a real visible one on January 6th. You would have expected a large counter protest of Antifa and BLM, given it was planned gathering of Trump supporters. Well, keep in mind, under this Mr. Sullivan, under other individuals who were exposed, including in online chats, you did have Antifa-aligned groups, people affiliated with Antifa, and you had people directly involved in BLM who were in the Capitol building during that incident and stated intent to do so and coordination to do so, meaning that they did what essentially they did what the Oath Keepers are being accused of doing. Are they also going to face charges? We'll have to see. Mr. Sullivan has been is possibly facing charges, not to the degree these individuals are. All right, let's go next. Let's see. This is from Jeff Tyler. He said, Josh, what actions can Patriots take to stop the momentum from the left? In my opinion, public awareness and public knowledge is the biggest one. Share articles with your friends. Don't cut off communication with people who, maybe friends or family member, just because you have trouble seeing eye to eye. My personal belief is that people, not all of them, but some people are still, a lot of people are still reasonable. You can still reason with people. And if you can show them evidence, if you can calmly talk to them, if you can calmly explain to them the truth of situations and bring to them rational, right, counter arguments and not get angry at them, I think you can really change people. I think you can really change society by having just rational discussions with your friends and family members. Share this video. Actually, I would hope that my content could get a broader audience, but to be honest, I don't know how much it could do that, but I would hope so. But on each of you individually, take our analysis, take our sources, take our research, and have rational discussions with people. Really a lot of what has happened in history happens through ignorance, right? Genocides and democides and communist takeovers. It often happens through ignorance. Solzhenitsyn said, when he was asked why could such horrors have taken place in Russia, his response is, we forgot God. Meaning that, they forgot the values, they forgot the principles, the morals, they forgot the things that allowed for social harmony and that allowed for people to come together under broader moral standards. If you forget those things, then anything can happen. But it's really on each and every one of us, in my opinion, to keep these things alive. When we stop interacting with each other, right? When we stop reasoning with each other, when we stop having real discussions and real dialogue and discourse, right, between opposing viewpoints, when that dies, then you have real conflicts. Then you have the kinds of things we've been watching happen in different parts of the world for the last 100 years under communist and socialist systems, right? 100 million people to 150 million people dead, killed by communism and its affiliated ideologies over the past 100 years. I would say don't cut people off. Try to have rational discussions and try to reason with people, even if doing so is hard. And being realistic, you're probably not going to make a lot of ground the first conversation. It takes time. You know what I mean? All right, last question, then we'll call it a night. This is from Deirdre Berger. He said, did you hear about the transportation secretary wanting travel tax? I did hear that. Yeah, they were talking about taxing people based on car mileage. Now, technically, they could just put an extra tax on gasoline because gasoline is basically already regulated by mileage anyways, because you get so many miles per gallon. Technically, that could just be done through a gas tax. And they might do that as well. This is what they're demonstrating doing with, for example, gun control, gun restrictions, we should say, is that they're doing it through taxes and through removing legal protections, meaning that they're putting additional taxes on gun owners, and they're talking about, for example, taking people's guns if you have what they classified as assault weapon, and they're talking about removing legal protections for gun manufacturers, meaning that just through the regulatory process, without having to, on the surface, ban them, they will have had the effect of banning them. Yeah, real quick, Jim B., you're saying, calling anything that exposes their evil a conspiracy theory is leftist poor attempt to challenge critical thinking. Yeah. And actually, folks, real quick too, you should check out some of the, if you want to good talking points with friends and family and so on, you should not all the interviews I do, but check out some of the interviews I do on communist ideology and so on, because when I talk to people about critical race theory, critical theory, history of communism, these things, I tried to bring up questions that people might ask, and you can listen to the answers people have and take the reasoning from those for your own discussions as well. You know, I really, through the course of the many interviews I'm planning to do, give you all the information and foundation that you could use to really explain all this stuff. Oh yeah, Nosy Judy said, "Where's the book list?" Yes, I need to get the book list together. I'm actually working on a few things. So I'm traveling for the next week and a half. In California right now. I'm going to be in Florida soon. I'm speaking at a CPAC panel on China, and I'll be doing some interviews there as well. As soon as I'm back in New York, we want to start, well, we're already working on, I should say, these different series that I've been talking about for a while, explaining the history of communism, socialism, and the nature of the ideology and what it has done. We're making good headway into, my team, making good headway into the creation of that special feature series, I should call it. We're also working on a few other special series like that. And now that I'm doing the lives 3 times a week instead of 6 times a week, again, Sunday, Tuesday, Thursday, that gives me a bit more time to work on that. And so, yeah, I'll get to the book list too. That was on the list. Anyways. All right, folks, I'm going to call it a night. It's been great talking with you all as always. I always enjoy doing these. Live Q&As. It's great talking with you all. Again, we'll be doing this again Sunday, 10:30 p.m. Eastern time. So be sure to tune in again Sunday, 10:30 p.m. Eastern time. I'll see you all then. And as always, please take care of yourselves, stay informed, and stay free. Thank you. Americans gradually losing faith in the different institutions this country is built upon, including now the electoral system, and including now as well the systems of justice. Now, America, on both sides, people are concerned about the integrity of our country, the integrity of the systems this country is built upon. And going forward, this country needs more than ever to find a way to reconcile with this corruption as they observe it, whether you're Democrat or Republican, observing politicians they believe do not represent them, observing justice systems they believe have not acted in accordance with the grievances they brought to them. The country right now is in a state of disarray and a state of hopelessness. And moving forward, I think more than ever, people need a ray of hope. People need to realize and understand once again, and see proof of it, that the system represents their interests, that the representatives we have in these offices represent the American people and not personal interest, that the systems of elections represent the will of the people and not the will of a handful of individuals who may not be willing to hear information or be willing to look at information. The United States is in a very desperate state right now. And for the world as well, this goes even deeper, because America was the beacon of hope. America was the model of a free society. America was the system on which the image of a free and open society was built. And many countries look to the United States as a model for their own countries, their own model for what a free and self-governing people look like. That model is now being damaged. That image is now being damaged. And countries are now wondering what model to look at. As we go forward, the Chinese Communist Party very likely will use this. The Chinese Communist Party will very likely try to rebuild itself. And the CCP's China model, as they call it, will become a competitor to the U.S. model on the global stage. This is where the United States and the world are now at.